Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to focus on the Rambam's treatment of the mitzvah of giving truma, separating the tithe that we give to the Kohen. So the Rambam, before he introduces all the halachas of truma, he gives an introduction where he lists the mitzvahs that are contained within this section. And the Rambam writes that there's a mitzvah over here to be mafresh truma, but he doesn't mention anything about giving truma. So the Rambam apparently is consistent with his opinion that he writes in his Sefer HaMitzvahs. In the Sefer HaMitzvahs, where he lists all the Taryag mitzvahs, he prefaces that with shroshim, with rules, 14 rules. And incidentally, the Rambam had an affection for the number 14. The Mishnah Torah is divided into 14 sections. The Sefer HaMitzvahs has 14 ground rules. The treatise on logic is divided into 14 chapters. The Moreh Nevuchim divides and categorizes mitzvahs into 14 categories. And of course, the Mishnah Torah has 14 volumes to it. But at any rate, the Rambam prefaces the rules of how do you determine what is a mitzvah and what is not a mitzvah. And in Sheresh Yud Beis, he mentions that the mitzvah of Hafrashas Terumah is one with the mitzvah of giving. There are no two separate mitzvahs. There's one mitzvah to be mafresh terumah. The Ramban takes strong issue with the Rambam about this, and he brings several proofs from different sources that the mitzvah of hafrasha is one mitzvah, and the mitzvah of nesina is another mitzvah. They're two separate mitzvahs. For example, one of his proofs is the fact that we make a bracha, it says in Tosefta, that before you mafresh terumah, you make a bracha on hafrashas terumah. If, according to the Rambam, the mitzvah of hafrashas terumah is one with giving, in other words, you're obligated to separate terumah to give to a kohen. Separating itself is not a mitzvah, according to the Rambam. The mitzvah is to separate to give to a kohen. If that's the case, then why would you make a bracha before you're mafresh? And the Ramban doesn't go into explaining his argument, but the argument is very simple. We know the Gemara in Menachos, and everyone agrees, the Rambam paskins like this, that when you have one mitzvah, but that mitzvah is incomplete, it's followed by another mitzvah. For example, building a sukkah. According to the Yerushalmi, you make a bracha when you build a sukkah. But the Bavli says, no, you don't make a bracha when you build a sukkah. Why? Because yesh achreha tzivoy. There's another tzivoy to dwell in the sukkah. So you make the bracha before you fulfill the completion of the mitzvah. So the argument, therefore, that the Ramban has against the Rambam is if the mitzvah of hafrasha is incomplete, if you just separate truma, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah until you give it to the kohen, you should make the bracha before giving it to the kohen. Why would you make a bracha before the hafrasha? And the truth is that the Rambam himself, in Perek Beis of Hilchos Terumos, near the end, paskins that you make a bracha before you mafresh terumah. But according to the Rambam's own interpretation of the mitzvah of hafrashas terumah, that it's connected to nesina, why would you make the bracha before hafrasha? Another question. If the mitzvah of hafrasha is not complete until you give it to the kohen, what would happen if a person separates terumah with the intention of giving to the kohen, and for some reason he doesn't give it to the kohen? That would mean, according to the Rambam, or at least according to the Ramban's understanding of the Rambam, that the hafrasha was worthless because he didn't fulfill the mitzvah. If a person builds a sukkah but doesn't dwell in it, he didn't fulfill the mitzvah. So in this case, if he's mafresh and he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah, which is the end result of the hafrasha is the nesina, in that case, the hafrasha is invalid. That means that the entire amount of produce that he designated some of it for truma would revert to being tevel, untithed produce, and it's forbidden to eat. That there's no one who suggests that, but why not? Hafrasha is worthless, is meaningless without the nesina, and if there's no nesina, then the hafrasha doesn't take any effect. I'd also like to add another question. from a Gemara in Yuma. The Gemara in Yuma discusses the din that if someone, let's say, is ill, and because of the illness that is life-threatening, they can't fast on Yom Kippur, they're allowed to eat. So there the Gemara discusses, the same thing would be true about anything that's forbidden, any forbidden food. If a person needs to eat a forbidden piece of meat, because it's a matter of life and death, he's allowed to do that. So the Gemara has a whole discussion about what happens if you have one or another forbidden food. Which one do you eat? Because you want to minimize the prohibition. So the discussion there is if you have a pile of tevel, untithed produce, which is forbidden, and you have truma, which is only permissible to a Kohen, and you're not a Kohen. So which one do you eat? Do you eat the tevel? Is tevel less stringent? Because tevel can be corrected. That's one argument. But on the other hand, truma is more stringent than tevel. And the Gemara discusses this. Now, let's take the Rambam's view that if you do hafrasha without nesina, the hafrasha is invalid. Then by the person eating the truma that he separated, there was no nesina, that would undo the whole hafrasha. And therefore, it would revert to being tevel. So what's the difference between eating tevel or eating truma? Either way, the truma will revert to becoming tevel. So this and many other arguments point to a different interpretation of the Rambam. And this is hinted in some of the commentaries on Sefer HaMitzvahs, Kina Sofrim, and so on. And the Sefer Nimukim Malbam from the Rosh Yeshiva of Teres Emes, Chabad Yeshiva, in his first siman, he elaborates on this at great length, that the Rambam is not really saying that hafrasha is not a mitzvah until you do the nesina, and that's why it's considered to be one mitzvah. No, absolutely not. The hafrasha is the nesina. As soon as you mafresh the truma reverts from your property to the property of the shevet of the Kohanim. So you already fulfilled the mitzvah of nesina. The fact that you have to give it to a Kohen, individual Kohen, is because otherwise it would be gzela. You have now in your possession property of the shevet of Kohanim, and therefore you have to give it to a Kohen, because otherwise you'd be withholding something that doesn't belong to you. But where did the nesina take place? The nesina took place immediately at the time of hafrasha. Hafrasha and nesina are synonymous. And that answers the question why you would make a bracha beforehand. Obviously, you make a bracha before the hafrasha because that is the whole mitzvah. It's not just part of the mitzvah that's followed up by another act. That is the mitzvah. There's a proof to the shita of the Rambam that is brought by Achreinim from the Gemara in Pesachim, Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. The Gemara there says, what happens if it's Pesach and you have chametz and you designate it as truma? What happens to that truma? So the Gemara says, no, it's not truma. Why? Because it says in the Torah, titen la, you give it to the Kohen, but not to his fire. If you're going to give him trumas chametz, he's going to have to burn it. So you're not giving it to him, you're giving it to his fire to destroy it. If you say, as the Ramban maintains, that there are two separate mitzvahs, where does it say titen lo, below la oire? Titen, it's about the nesina. So just because the nesina you can't do doesn't mean you can't do the hafrasha and make it truma. It could be truma, you didn't fulfill the second mitzvah, two separate mitzvahs. According to the Rambam, there's no question, because according to the Rambam, if you do the hafrasha, that itself is nesina. So if it's a nesina to the fire, it's not considered a nesina. We would have to say, in defense of the Ramban, we can't say the Ramban didn't know this Gemara. The Ramban would maintain that yes, it's true, hafrasha is one mitzvah, nesina is another mitzvah, but it's well established that the reason why you mafresh truma is to give it to the Kohen. One mitzvah is linked to the next mitzvah. Just like we have the binyan Beis HaMikdash. The Rambam writes, and the Ramban doesn't necessarily disagree with this, that the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash is to be muchan l'hakrav by karbanos, so you can bring sacrifices. Now, karbanos is a separate mitzvah from building the Beis HaMikdash, l'kula alma. So what happens if you build the Beis HaMikdash, but you built it in a way that you can't bring a carbon? Did you fulfill the mitzvah of Asli Migdash? No, because the whole purpose of this mitzvah, of Binya Beis HaMikdash, is to facilitate another mitzvah of Lahakra Bei Karbanis. The same thing over here. The mitzvah of Hafrashas Terumah, the Ramban will agree, is for the ultimate goal of giving it to the Kohen. If it's not possible to give to the Kohen, then it's not considered to be a valid fulfillment of the mitzvah of Hafrasha. There's another dispute of Rishonim that we could connect, and as Achreinim do connect, to the dispute between the Rambam and the Ramban. There's a Tosfos in Gittin that says that since the halacha is that in order to take something that is tevel and to turn it into truma, chita achas peteres esakri, one piece of wheat takes care of the whole pile. That's all you need is one. What about giving to the Kohen? It doesn't have to have any value, Tosfos says. One little piece of wheat may not even be worth a pruta. But nevertheless, you fulfill the mitzvah because truma requires only chita achas. The Tosfos Rid, one of the Rishonim, and the Noda B'Yehuda himself says the same thing, but I'll bring you the Tosfos Rid. But the Tosfos Rid says that no, there's a mitzvah of hafrashas terumah, any amount suffices. And then there's a mitzvah of nesina, of giving it to the Kohen. Nesina has to be a double chashuv. It has to be worth at least a pruta. So this dispute seems to be parallel to the dispute between the Rambam and the Ramban. According to the Rambam, the mitzvah of hafrasha and nesina is one. So if the hafrasha is good enough with chita achas, so is the nesina. It's one mitzvah. The Ramban, on the other hand, holds that it's two separate mitzvahs. And yes, the hafrasha is one pruta, one chita, even less than a pruta, rather, and the nesina has to be a pruta, the two separate mitzvahs. The only problem is that what is the difference between this and trumas chametz? When you are mafresh one chita, that can't be you can't give that to the Kohen. It's not a fulfillment of the mitzvah of nesina. So it means you did hafrasha in a way that it can't be nesina. So I think that question, Sefer B'Fikei Yam asks it. I think the answer is very simple. We don't mean that when you do the mitzvah of hafrasha, you have to do it in a way that you can fulfill the mitzvah of nesina. What is the goal of nesina? The goal of nesina is that the Kohen should get it. So if the hafrasha is in a way that the Kohen will never get it, it'll go straight to his fire in the case of chametz, then obviously that's not called hafrasha because it'll never get to the Kohen. But if it's a hafrasha of one chita that'll get to the Kohen, though you may not fulfill the mitzvah of nesina properly, but at least it's going to go to the Kohen, and therefore the hafrasha may be a valid hafrasha. There's much more to discuss. This is a very extensive sugya, and there are those who may disagree about the way the Rambam Shita is interpreted, but this is just one insight to give people some food for thought as they delve into the depth of the Rambam's words and teachings.